Before I begin, I want to thank you for supporting this independent podcast. As with all independent podcasters, I simply want to share my geekery. I know that every download is a connection, and it spurs me on to put in the hours to write and record and edit and share. I want to shout out to a good friend of mine at Into the Darkness podcast. Brother Joe has helped steer me to some really good movie choices over the past few weeks. He does a great job at reviewing the horror genre and is always willing to help answer any questions you may have. I hope that you will support his efforts. Now, on to tonight's show. It used to be that every culture around the world understood that monsters exist and that they are in fact evil, and that their purpose for living is to destroy humanity. But that is no longer the case. It used to be that the stories we told about these monsters served as cautionary tales. These tales informed and alerted us to the truth that we humans are on the menu. But our stories have changed. Now the vast majority of humanity no longer believes monsters are real. And because of that, monsters have come to represent people who are different or misunderstood or outcasts in some way. They have become sympathetic characters and are now used with increasing frequency in stories about forbidden love, or even in a more bizarre twist, they have come to represent goodness. I am Lafayette Faust. And it is my belief that these modern paranormal love stories are deadly dangerous. Monsters and evil beings are not misunderstood creatures who need our affections. They want to tear our bodies, taint our souls, feed off our flesh, and drain us of our innocence. But because of our willingness to redefine evil as good, we literally are serving ourselves up as the main course in the enemy's dark feast. Tonight's story is about a group of vampire lovers who have separated themselves from society and live the lifestyle that they think frees them. They dress the part, act the part, and wish they could meet a real vampire in person. In this story, the real vampires show up, and hard lessons are learned. So, with that idea nibbling in the pulsing vein in your neck, I invite you to sit back, turn on a light, and prepare yourself. The morning was clear, the rays of the late summer sun highlighting everything in gold, and yellow butterflies shimmered as they flitted around the property of Crook Manor. Narciso Crook stood on the edge of the deep porch that wrapped around the stately house. He wore $500 sunglasses, and his long dark hair was pulled up in a man bun. He had draped the hood of the flowing druid's cloak carefully around his head in such a way to highlight his sharp jawline. His given name was Chadwick, but he'd had it legally changed to Narciso when he had decided to live his truth, which was that he had chosen to identify as a vampire. He was an attractive man by modern standards, which meant he was not burly or rugged, but instead was lean and pretty. He was popular and influential with both sexes, though none of his followers could be described as psychologically or philosophically mature. In fact, they were all as vain as he, though not with his money or influence. When he turned 21, he was awarded access to his trust fund and moved out of his family's massive Cape Cod and into Crook Manor, which had been built by his great-grandfather in 1910. After only 1 month, he began allowing some of his followers to live with him, as long as they too embraced the vampire lifestyle, which he believed consisted of being pretty, promiscuous, and drinking each other's blood. He was now 25 and had a small cult of 30 who lived with him in the mansion. He provided for their every material need, and they provided him with all his carnal needs. The townsfolk liked to derisively refer to Narcisso's cult as Sparkletown, in reference to the books and movies wherein the vampires brooded and sparkled. He knew of the slight, and it pissed him off, but he always calmed himself by remembering that most of the townsfolk were poor and unattractive. His disciples had already retired to their rooms to sleep the day away. It had been a long night of sex and revelry and feeding and drinking. He alone was still awake to witness the butterflies and the birds and hear the susurration of the breeze through the trees. Being the alpha of his brood, he was the only one allowed to stay up beyond dawn. He used these early morning moments to reflect on his influence and his wealth. His disciples loved him and hung on his every word as he spoke his brand of narcissistic wisdom into their ears. Narciso believed that humanity was a blight on the earth and should be eradicated. He felt that only the rich and powerful pretty people should be allowed to live. There would, of course, need to be a servant class, but they must also be attractive, though never allowed to gain money or power. After a while, he turned to step into the house and take his place in his bed with two of his closest disciples when he heard the sound of a car approaching. Curious as to how someone could have gotten through the gate, he looked down the long tree-lined drive. A turquoise Aston Martin growled around the circle drive and came to a stop in front of the manor. Narciso was impressed. The car was shark sleek and expensive. His own Aston Martin had cost him $500,000, and this one seemed to have a custom color which would have added to the cost. He was even more impressed by the couple who stepped out of the car and approached him. The passenger was a girl who appeared to be in her 20s. She was Eurotrash pretty with long blonde hair and colorful sleeve of tattoos covering her arm. She wore only a vest and red leather pants. The driver was a lithe and sculpted man who wore a form-fitting silk shirt and suit pants. Dark eyeliner accentuated his deep blue eyes. They stopped at the bottom step and looked at Narciso. He felt powerful as he looked down on this pretty couple. "How did you get beyond the gate?" The man looked over at the girl. He nodded, and she said, "Last weekend we were guests of one of your disciples. We saw her enter the code." Narciso had no security other than the gated wall that surrounded the manor. He made a mental note to look into procuring a security service and ensuring that his disciples understood the need for caution. Not everyone understood or agreed with his lifestyle or philosophy. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I am Alexis, and this is Valentino. We also identify as vampires, and we have been sent by our alpha to make an introduction." Narciso was intrigued. He hadn't realized there was another brood in the area. He flicked the manicured fingers of his hand, indicating that they should continue. "After attending your party last weekend, I went back to our brood and told my alpha," Alexis said. "He was impressed by the debauchery that I witnessed here." Narciso's pride surged. He had few rules. He only required that his brood understand that he was their alpha, their reason for existing, and that they serve his every desire. Beyond that, he believed in the creed put forth by Aleister Crowley, which was, "Do what thou wilt." On his property, in his mansion, his followers were allowed to do whatever their hearts desired. "I am a gracious alpha," he replied. He was so blinded by his narcissism that he did not catch Valentino give a slight roll of his eyes. Alexis cut her eyes at Valentino, as if to imply that he should be more careful in hiding his emotions. Then she locked eyes with Narciso. "That was clear last weekend. Our alpha wishes an audience with you." Narciso suppressed a self-satisfied smile. He did not want these two minions to see his excitement. He wanted to project strength through self-confidence and superiority through personal beauty. He pretended to mull over the idea of a meeting, though he was nearly quivering with excitement. After a dramatic pause, he said, "What is your alpha's name?" "His name is Max," said Valentino. Narciso was disappointed. Max wasn't a captivating vampire name. Should he even entertain meeting with another alpha who lacked creativity? As he considered, he remembered from studying Latin that Maximilian meant greatest. Maybe this alpha used the shortened version of this name for some ridiculously boring reason. He must be rich and powerful, though, to afford such a fine car as the Aston Martin and to draw to himself such modernly beautiful disciples. Finally, he relented. "I'm open to the idea of a meeting," he said. "Excellent," Valentino said. "He hopes to come here tonight." Narciso smiled at the deference to his power and authority. "Oh, I'll allow it." "He will be here at midnight," Alexis said. Her tone had lost its soft, pleasant quality, and now had a hard, authoritarian edge. "Be prepared to receive him." Narciso felt as if he had somehow lost the power position of this meeting, but before he could attempt to regain his dominance, Alexis and Valentino got back into the sleek sports car and sped off down the lane and out the gate. Narciso stood for a moment, replaying the meeting in his head. He finally decided that, as minions, they must have simply been in a hurry to report back to Max that he had been granted audience here at Crook Manor. He made a mental note to discuss this slight with him, alpha to alpha, so that Max could punish Alexis and Valentino. Feeling as if he had regained his dominance, he went into the manor, made his way up to the master's suite, and climbed into bed. His alarm went off at sunset. His personal assistant, a young man named Crank, helped bathe him and get him clothed in his sexiest outfit. Once dressed in leather pants, white flowing shirt, and body glitter, he called his brood together in his spacious library and told them the news. "When Max's entourage arrives tonight, I will receive him in my throne room. After I hear what he has to say, I will invite him to participate in our nightly debauchery." The air was heavy with carnal excitement at what was to come. This was a new experience for them all, and he hoped that Max and his minions were as modernly beautiful as Alexis and Valentino. "When should we expect them?" someone said from the crowd. "Midnight," Narciso replied. He looked down at his phone. "We have just under 4 hours to prepare. I want our best wine and food. I expect each of you to look your best and be willing to submit in whatever way they desire. We don't want to disappoint." The door to the library swung open, and Robin, a delicate little thing with wide anime eyes and pierced lips, walked in and said, "Someone's coming. I think it may be them." "That's impossible," Narciso said, frowning at the idea that Max would be 4 hours early. He swept past the girl, through the mansion, and out onto the porch. His disciples stood fanned around and behind him. It was full-on dark, and the crescent moon poked above the trees like the tip of a ghostly blade. He looked down the long, tree-lined driveway and heard the thunder of motorcycles. Landscape lighting was spaced every 50 feet on both sides, painting the drive with dramatic shadows. "I was on a walk and I heard them pull up at the gate," Robin said. I ran here to tell you." Narciso was excited to meet another alpha, hopeful it would lead to a night of heightened decadence, but he simply could not allow this slight to go unmentioned. One simply did not show up 4 hours early. The thunder of powerful engines increased, and he saw a row of cyclopean headlights heading toward the mansion. He counted only 5, which caused him further disappointment. He had hoped that Max would bring a bigger entourage. Variety made for a tastier buffet. The riders swung around the circle and parked their massive bikes in front of the porch. They cut their engines, collapsing the night into silence, and all but one dismounted. Narciso recognized Alexis and Valentino. There was also a lanky, stringy-haired blonde who looked as if she should be bartending a shithole honky-tonk. Stepping beside her was a wiry man with a scruffy beard that barely hid 2 long scars on his face. He wore a trucker's hat and was chewing tobacco. Then there was the man who still sat astraddle his massive bike. He was lumberjack thick, which was unappealing to Narciso. He preferred the sculpt of a bodybuilder. In fact, even Alexis and Valentino were no longer dressed in chic Eurotrash fashion. Instead, they wore jeans and t-shirts and biker boots. Narciso stood straight, making everyone aware that he was the center of attention. He lifted his chin and in defiance said, "You're early. This is unacceptable. I'll be taking this up with your alpha." The man continued to sit on the bike. He looked at Narciso. His eyes were the color of worn leather. The scruff covered his square jaw like cactus spikes. The power that radiated from his gaze caused a sense of foreboding to squirm in Narciso's heart. The man kept his eyes on Narciso. "That would be me," he said. His voice was low and snarly. Narciso was confused, off balance. Surely an alpha would never allow himself to look like a common farmhand, nor would he surround himself with a honky-tonk brood. Either way, Narciso was done with this scene. He was disappointed and would not allow any of these lowlives to participate in any of tonight's carnal debauchery. He simply could not allow them to taint his beautiful brood. "You're Max?" he said, keeping his chin up in defiance, letting his disdain show. "Yes," Max said, "and from the smug egalitarian disgust on your face, it seems you aren't impressed with me or my family." Narciso did not like the clear challenge in that statement. He was confused at how such an ordinary-looking man could radiate such power. It bled from him and charged the air with thirsty expectation. Narciso would never allow his brood or himself to dress so commonly. Alphas especially needed to dress in such a refined way to show that they were the most beautiful and wealthy of the brood. But this man debased himself and his followers by allowing such redneckery. Narciso wanted Max and his trailer trash gone. "I will admit," he said, "that I expected something a bit different. I feel it's best that I rescind my invitation to participate in tonight's festivities." Max dismounted his bike. "I can see by all this pageantry that this group has fallen victim to the Hollywood idea of vampirism," he replied. His voice was grizzled and low. "Would you agree, Janine?" The stringy-haired blonde smiled and nodded. When she spoke, her voice sounded like roadhouse gravel. "Seems pretty clear to me, Max." The lanky man with the trucker hat spat a black wad onto the ground. Then, in a hick slur, he said, "You know what they say about Hollywood vampires?" "What would that be, Shane?" Max asked. Shane stood with his thumbs hooked in his garish belt buckle. It was silver and imprinted with the word cowboy. "Hollywood gets it wrong." Narciso heard the taunt in their tone. He was over this toxicity. These people showed up, looking like trailer park assholes, and were creating a hostile environment, seeming to mock him and his disciples for following their truth. "I'm asking you to leave. Now, please." Max continued to stand by his massive bike. "You know what Hollywood gets right about vampires, Shane?" "Yeah," Shane said. "I believe I do. That would be that a vampire has to be invited into a person's home before they can enter. And I believe we was invited." "I only invited Max," Narciso said. He could feel a growing restlessness from his people. Their carnal excitement was morphing into caution and confusion. They were afraid of these people. "I never invited the rest of you." Max laughed. It was low, bestial. "Oh, but you did. when you extended the invitation to me through Alexis and Valentino, I was officially free to come and go anytime I please, anywhere on your property. And because I was given authority, I decided to invite my whole family. Narciso felt this was all getting out of hand. He hoped that he could use his obvious wealth and beauty as a powerful influence over these gross people. He knew that's how society worked. The pretty and the wealthy had all the power. And besides, what kind of alpha would ever let his followers speak to him so casually, as if they were equals, or even worse, call him family? Did Max not understand the leadership dynamic? I perfectly understand the leadership dynamic, Max said. And it has nothing to do with that erroneous, entitled idea that you have eating away inside your narcissistic brain. Narciso felt his blood turn cold. How did you know what I was thinking? He said, his voice revealing a quiver. His disciples began to murmur and shuffle nervously. They could feel the shift of power from Narciso to Max. The air continued to build with an ominous charge. Max smiled. It was feral, taunting. Once you let me in, I also get to access your thoughts. Wait, Narciso said, his voice full on shaky. This doesn't make sense. You're saying that you're a real vampire? Shane and Janine and Alexis and Valentino all laughed. Max shot them a glance and chuckled along with them. When he turned back to Narciso, his smile had transformed from human to monster. 2 thick fangs knifed down while 2 smaller fangs thrust up from the jaw. Narciso was terrified, his legs suddenly weak. These fangs were less Hollywood and more ape-like. A vampire's smile was supposed to be erotic and sexy. There was nothing sexy about this smile. Every single one of Narciso's brood gasped and squirmed with fear, but were rooted in place by some unseen power and forced to watch the scene unfold. A couple of them began to cry. Max pointed at Robin, the girl with the pierced lips and the anime eyes. Come here, he said. She lurched down the steps as if not in control of her own body. Tears streamed down her face. She trembled so violently that her teeth rattled. She stopped in front of Max. Please, don't hurt me, she pleaded. There was the slightest lisp as Max spoke through his thick fangs. Instead of diminishing the terror, it heightened the horror. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. You're not my type. Shane stepped over, his own thick fangs gleaming in the wash from the dramatic landscape lighting. He pushed his trucker hat back from his forehead and grabbed Robin by her short hair. But I sure do like you freaky-looking ones. He bent her head back and attacked her throat with savagery. He ripped away a chunk of flesh. Blood sprayed. The crowd gasped and began crying and wailing and screaming. Yet they could not move. Shane let the blood that pulsed from her severed carotid spray into his mouth, over his chin and face. He laughed in delight, and for dramatic effect he took one more bite, breaking vertebrae and severing the head from the neck. Robin's body fell to the ground. Shane held her head up at the crowd. Then he tossed it at them. It smacked against Crank's chest, causing him to squeal like a child. Then it thumped to the porch. Everyone was in complete fight or flight, yet their feet were held firmly to the ground. They wailed and begged and whimpered. Max stepped over Robin's body, which twitched on the ground. He walked up the stairs and stood directly in front of Narciso. A real man is strong enough to protect his own, he growled, grimacing at Narciso's pretty boy looks and effete attire. Then he turned his attention to Narciso's disciples. You followed this man for all the wrong reasons, and he has failed you. Max snapped his fingers, releasing his power over the crowd. They shot off in all directions, fleeing from the monsters in front of them. Alexis and Valentino and Shane and Janine all had those terrifying ape-like fangs. Without a word, they shot off after the cultists. They were panther quick, and the night became thick with the screams of the cultists as Max's brood ripped their throats, tore their limbs, and bathed in their blood. Narciso wanted to beg for his life, but his fear was so profound that he could only make a pitiful whimpering noise. Finally, he was able to say, "Please, don't kill me." "I'm not going to kill you," Max said. "I'm going to break you." Max stepped aside, allowing Narciso full view of the vast yard. Because of the dramatic landscape lighting, he was able to bear witness to the carnage. Occasionally, the arterial spray was so strong that it rained hot crimson droplets across the yard onto Narciso. The savagery was so intense, the vampire's glee so primal that Narciso felt that he had witnessed something pornographic. When the carnage was complete, and all were torn and drained, he stood covered in gore, and tears spilled from his eyes and mixed with the blood. Max released his hold on him, and he fell to his knees, completely drained of vanity and arrogance. Broken for the first time in his life, he dared not look up at Max. He sobbed at the vampire's feet, blood and snot and tears splattering his boots. Why, he murmured. Max leaned down and yanked Narciso's man bun, forcing his eyes up. "Because you pissed me off with this ridiculous cosplay vampire bullshit," Max said. Narciso wiped bloody snot from his face. "But I wasn't hurting anybody." Narciso wanted to look away from those thick, dangerous fangs, but Max yanked his man bun, forced him to look. "You know better than that," he snarled. "You and I are the same in that we prey on the weak. You do it for your ego. I do it for the blood." I'm sorry, Narciso sobbed. There was hatred in Max's leather-colored eyes. "Are you?" he said. "Have you learned the lesson here?" Narciso's scalp hurt as Max pulled his hair. He tasted blood on his lips and felt bile rise in his throat. His heart hammered. His soul ached. He was not sure of the lesson, was afraid to answer in case he was wrong and would suffer more humiliation. "Please," he begged, "tell me. I want to know." Max frowned and let go of Narciso's hair. He turned and motioned for his brood to saddle up. As the motorcycles rumbled to life, he glanced back at Narciso and said, "Both of us are evil, but only one of us knows it." Then he turned and rode down the long driveway, followed by his brood, leaving Narciso on his knees, surrounded by the dead.